Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are around the planet. Welcome to ITIF's webinar, Growth with the Right Balance, the Future of the Federal Energy RD&D Budget. My name is David Hart, and I'm going to moderate today's session. I'm the director of the Clean Energy Innovation Program at ITIF and a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. This event grows out of a collaborative project that our Clean Energy team has undertaken with colleagues from Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy. Our full report will be issued next week, but we're going to preview some of the findings today and hear a variety of perspectives on this important topic. First up, I'm really pleased and excited to welcome Representative Suzanne Bonamici. Representative Bonamici is a Democrat who represents Oregon's 1st District in the western part of the state. She's a member of the House Science Committee, as well as a member of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And she has a long-standing interest in science and the environment. So she's an ideal choice for opening up this conversation. And I want to thank her for making the time. And I'm going to turn over the podium to her for some opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar and for your dedication for expediting our transition to a clean energy economy. As you heard, I'm Suzanne Bonamici. I'm honored to represent the northwest part of the state of Oregon. And I first want to acknowledge that this is a challenging time to be discussing forward-looking policies. Coronavirus cases continue to surge, unemployment rates are unprecedented, and our communities are having long overdue conversations about systemic racism and extreme weather events and wildfires like those right here in Oregon are jeopardizing lives and livelihoods. But even in this moment in time when our communities are struggling and inequalities are more apparent than ever, the climate crisis continues and we cannot wait any longer to take meaningful action. And that's why I'm excited to see today's Energizing America report from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy. And I'm pleased that it recognizes that the expedited deployment of existing clean energy technologies can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But full decarbonization of our economy will require new technologies that have yet to be invented. This report truly makes the case for rapidly scaling up federal investments in clean energy RD&D. As a member of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, I recently joined my colleagues in releasing a bold, comprehensive, and science-based climate action plan that sets our nation on a path to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. These are science-based targets, and importantly, they are achievable. The nonpartisan think tank Energy Innovation found that implementing our climate action plan would reduce net overall greenhouse gas emissions by 37% below 2010 levels in 2030 and 88% below 2010 levels in 2050, provide nearly $8 trillion in cumulative climate and health benefits through 2050, and importantly, avoid 62,000 premature deaths annually by 2050. Throughout our efforts in crafting this plan, we recognize that the climate crisis affects our entire economy, and it will take our entire economy to address it. Our climate action plan is divided into 12 pillars. Each contains building blocks or recommendations. Environmental justice and the needs of workers are incorporated in each pillar. Together, the pillars construct a meaningful set of policies to accelerate our transition to 100% clean energy economy, focus on the needs of frontline communities, and importantly, create good paying jobs. As a leader on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, I've been working across the aisle for the last 8 years to advance legislation to accelerate our transition to 100% clean energy economy. Our climate action plan would help boost the deployment of existing clean energy technologies like wind and solar in the short term by extending and expanding tax incentives for clean energy, including the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. But because full decarbonization of the economy will require transformational technologies that have yet to be deployed and commercialized, our plan recommits to and builds on the Mission Innovation Commitments, a global initiative to accelerate global clean energy innovation from the Obama administration, and it substantially increases investments in clean energy research, development, demonstration, and deployment over the next 10 years. We empower the Department of Energy to make climate a priority in its mission and to reorganize its structure to accomplish these efforts. Our plan also rapidly increases funding for the RD&D program, which supports high-risk, high-reward innovation. Historically, federally funded research and development has not always reflected state and regional capabilities and market needs. Additionally, federal investments often focus on the conceptual and early research stages, and that leaves valuable projects facing the commercialization valley of death. So I'm pleased that our climate action plan includes my Regional Clean Energy Innovation Act to support clean energy innovation in the mid and post-research stage. To successfully deploy clean energy resources on a massive scale no later than mid-century and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we must harness and align local, state, tribal, regional, and national solutions. In 2016, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released a report highlighting the value of regional partnerships to advance clean energy deployment and commercialization. And the report called for Regional Energy Innovation and Development Institutes, or REITs. My Regional Clean Energy Innovation Act will direct the Secretary of Energy to create an Office of Advanced Clean Energy Technologies. This new office will manage a network of REITs to accelerate clean energy innovation in the post-research stage, to help projects overcome obstacles to deployment and commercialization, to connect federally funded research and development with state and regional initiatives, and to advance decarbonization strategies. So these efforts will complement the existing work at ARPA-E and EERE. As co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus, I'm also excited that our climate action plan recognizes that the ocean can play a part in the transition to 100% clean energy. My home state of Oregon is at the forefront of marine energy thanks to the leadership of Oregon State University, the Pacific Marine Energy Center, and pioneering businesses like Vigor. Last year, I had a chance to visit the ocean energy device built by workers at Vigor before it got tugged into the Columbia River off the Pacific coast for deployment off the shores of Hawaii. It was not until I was standing in front of the enormous device that I grasped the scale of this resource and what we can gain from it. And importantly, extracting power from moving water can be done without jeopardizing the integrity of marine environments. Marine energy has tremendous potential as one of the last untapped renewable energy sources, and federal investment can help unlock it. Our ocean covers more than 70% of the surface of the planet, and its waves, currents, and tides can be used as a plentiful, renewable resource to power homes, buildings, and communities. According to the Department of Energy, there's enough kinetic energy in waves and tides along the US coastlines to meet a significant portion of our nation's needs. Our climate action plan would advance research, development, and deployment of marine energy in a responsible manner. So the climate action plan is a clear, comprehensive, science-based roadmap for Congress. In the coming months, I will continue to work with my colleagues to advance the legislation and recommendations from the plan, but this won't happen without your continued hard work and advocacy. So thank you again for your leadership on these issues. It truly does make a difference. I look forward to our continued work together to advance climate action, and I hope you have a productive and informative webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Representative Bonamici, for those remarks and for your leadership in this field and for your work on the climate crisis report. I understand you have to get to a hearing. So we appreciate your making the time. And again, our best wishes for this difficult period. I know it's tough in Portland right now.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Great. So our webinar is going to continue with a number of speakers, and I want to first lay out the run of show for our viewers. So we're going to begin with David Sandalow, one of the co-authors of our report from Columbia University, and he'll offer some brief opening remarks to our work, and then Colin Cunliffe, my colleague at ITIF, will provide the main presentation for our group. And they should take about 20 minutes together. Then we're going to turn the podium over to Jeremy Harrell from ClearPath to share his organization's perspectives on the future of the energy RD&D budget. And that should leave us around half an hour for conversation and questions. And I would invite viewers to submit their questions through the Slido link below the view panel on your screen. And for the panel, we're joined by Kim Dean from the Bipartisan Policy Center and Varun Sivaram, who's the lead author on our report, who has joint affiliations with both Columbia and ITIF. So again, please submit your questions through the Slido link on the live stream. So now let me briefly introduce David and Colin, and I'll introduce the other speakers as each one comes to make their remarks. So David is at Columbia University School for International and Public Affairs and the Center for Global Energy Policy. He's had a distinguished career as a researcher, including contributing to this report, and also, and perhaps more prominently as a public servant, working at the White House, the State Department, and the Department of Energy, most recently as the Undersecretary of Energy. So he'll go first, and he'll be followed by Colin Cunliffe, who's a senior policy analyst at ITIF, and was the point person for ITIF on this report. Colin has a PhD in physics. He worked as a AAAS fellow on Capitol Hill and at the Department of Energy before joining ITIF. Among many other things, he follows the budget and appropriations process for us. And all detailed budget questions will be directed to him, I think. So with that, let me turn it over to David and thank him for joining us.
David, thank you very much. It's my delight to preview the report that we'll be releasing next week, our Energizing America report, which calls for a national energy innovation mission. It's been an enormous pleasure to work with you and with Colin. I'm so impressed by the work that you do at ITIF and with Varun, who's also on the screen here. It's been a great team and just a superb effort. Our report, thank you. I see Colin's pulling up. So there's the cover of our book, which is going to be released next week and available on Amazon for purchase next week. And you can advance to the next slide there, Colin. And to the next slide, I guess back one. So back in the 2007-2008 period, there were two very influential reports on energy innovation that were released. The Rising Above the Gathering Storm report was prepared by the National Academy of Sciences and National Academy of Engineering, called for establishment of RPE and other important steps. And then there was an important report produced by Pete Ogden, John Podesta, and John Deutsch in 2008 by Center for American Progress. I was part of the Obama transition team, part of a small team working on energy environment that went in 2 days after the 2008 election to a small nondescript building at the corner of 6th and E to start to plan an first part of an Obama administration. And these books were on our shelves during the transition. And then I was also privileged to be part of the Obama administration in its early stages as we were thinking about what to do during the Recovery Act period and beyond. And these books were on our shelves then as well. And one takeaway I have from the privilege of that public service is that having well-researched, well-thought-out, well-vetted policy proposals can be enormously valuable to policymakers. And what we aim to do with this Energizing America report is provide just that, to provide thoughtful recommendations that have been tested against expertise in a number of different sectors that policymakers can use if they have the opportunity in the years ahead. Next slide, please. One important point on this is that this issue is as bipartisan, I think, as almost any these days. And so I think this report can be very valuable, whatever happens in the November elections, and to Congress, next year and the year beyond in almost any scenario. I managed the energy budgets in the Energy Department during the first part of the Obama administration, during part of that, and those budgets have actually increased in the past 4 years. They've increased, notwithstanding the fact that the Trump administration has proposed cuts. But as a result of bipartisan consensus, those budgets have actually, pretty steadily increased, actually year after year, reflecting, I think, broad bipartisan support for the clean energy innovation agenda. Next slide. But although there is bipartisan support, there, I would say, is a lack of overall vision, and certainly details are scarce. And when it gets down to actual policymaking, actual legislating, those types of details, are incredibly important, and we aim to fill that gap. And I particularly, I must say, want to thank Colin Cunliffe for his tremendous work with the budget part of our report. Next slide. So our report has two parts. Just highlight them briefly here, and Colin will talk about the rest. The first part asks, why should the United States ramp up clean energy funding? And then what's the right target? We look at a number of reasons that it makes sense to ramp up clean energy funding, at externalities that aren't being addressed in the private market, and other factors. And then in some ways, the hardest question, I think, from our authored discussions, the hardest question that we asked was, what's the right number? And if the goal is to speed energy innovation, we want to give it as much money as we possibly can, but not too much money, not money that would be wasted. And so it's striking the right balance between providing enough money to accelerate innovation, but making sure it isn't wasted can be a challenge. And we decided to propose $25 billion by 2025, which is a very ambitious ramp, almost tripling over the course of 5 fiscal years, but we think it's doable. We think the money can be absorbed and spent well, and we provide a lot of detail on that. Next slide, please. And then I won't spend detail on this, spend time on this, but we proposed 10 technology pillars, 6 strategic principles, and 3 immediate actions. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Colin to provide more detail.
All right, thanks, David. Again, it was a pleasure working with you and Varun. So I'll take it from here. I'll begin by laying out the need to accelerate clean energy innovation and make the case for increased federal funding. So first, innovation is essential for addressing climate change. The International Energy Agency just came out with a report that found that half of the emissions reductions that the world needs to achieve net zero emissions come from technologies that aren't yet commercially available. And we know that expanding public investment in clean energy research, development, and demonstration can hasten decarbonization. So this figure shows US energy carbon emissions under 3 different technology scenarios. Under the baseline scenario in blue, emissions stay roughly flat with today's levels. Now, if the Department of Energy at current funding levels were to meet its targets for clean energy, emissions could decline by 23% by 2040. And if Congress were to double DOE's RD&D budget, then we could see an additional 15% emissions reductions. So clearly, RD&D is an important part of the decarbonization toolkit. Additionally, investments in innovation can help America get its mojo back and increase domestic energy industries. So the global energy industry is a $2 trillion industry, and the share of that is devoted to clean energy has been increasing. In 2019, global investment in renewable energy alone was $300 billion with a B dollars. And investment in hydrogen production, electric vehicles is also increasing. And the United States risks missing out on these advanced energy industries. The US currently invests 0.04% of its GDP in energy RD&D, trailing 13 other countries. And China invests twice as much. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity here, and the United States has one of the world's best innovation systems and is well positioned to lead in many of these nascent industries in advanced nuclear and carbon capture and digital energy. Now, private investment is also essential, and private innovation and public innovation really complement each other. Private innovation is really focused on incremental improvements to existing technologies that have near-term payoffs. But new energy technologies can take decades of development and billions of dollars of investment before achieving commercial success. And private investors are simply unable to shoulder that entire risk on their own. That's why corporate investment in clean energy RD&D is far lower than other industries. So major energy firms invest about 0.5% of their revenue on RD&D, and that's far below companies in the pharmaceutical sector or in information technologies. And historically, we've seen that public energy RD&D can actually stimulate additional private sector investment. So in other words, every federal dollar of investment in RD&D stimulates additional private sector funding. And this is why many private sector leaders are calling on the government to increase funding for clean energy RD&D. So again, I want to go back to this goal of 25 billion by 2025. This is not unprecedented. So federal investment put a man on the moon and launched the domestic civilian nuclear energy industry. And we currently invest heavily in defense and in health research. So this shows that we can marshal the innovative capacity of the United States on the scale that we are recommending. 25 billion by 2025 is roughly 0.1% of GDP. And this would bring energy RD&D to about half of what the US currently invests in health research, and is also equivalent to what the US invested 40 years ago when the Department of Energy was created in the late 70s. So we feel that the urgency of climate change demands a commensurate level of investment. Now, tripling federal funding does not mean tripling the Department of Energy's budget. So as part of our research, we assembled the first government-wide estimate of clean energy RD&D since 2016, and the Office of Management and Budget prepared its estimates for mission innovation. What we found is that other agencies such as the Department of Defense, NASA, the National Science Foundation invest about $1.8 billion on clean energy research. And we make recommendations for all of these agencies so that increases aren't concentrated in a single agency's budget. So that is the opening salvo, the part one of the volume. I'm now going to move to part two, which lays out the details of the roadmap. So we start with 10 technology pillars that should form the basis of the clean energy RD&D portfolio. And each pillar groups technologies based on distinct applications. So for example, nuclear and renewable power are grouped in pillar 2, clean electricity generation. Some technologies find homes in multiple pillars. Energy storage, for example, is split among pillar 3, transportation, pillar 4, clean fuels, and pillar 5, grid modernization. Energy efficiency touches all of the pillars, but is most concentrated in the end-use sectors. So pillar 3, transportation, pillar 6, buildings, and pillar 7, the industrial sector. We feel that this approach, rather than a technology-based structure, places the focus on achieving the functionality needed for decarbonization. And then as policymakers build their portfolio around these 10 pillars, we have identified 6 strategic principles to help them manage and maximize the effectiveness of the portfolio. So this first principle is that we need to match the funding portfolio to critical decarbonization needs. On the left here, you see US greenhouse gas emissions arranged by economic sector, and transportation and the electricity generation sector come in first, followed closely by the industrial sector, and then by buildings and agriculture. On the right, you see DOE's research, development, and demonstration portfolio, also allocated by economic sector. And what you can see is it's heavily weighted to the electricity sector, nearly half. A quarter is energy science and cross-cutting technologies, and then the end-use sectors, buildings, industry, and transportation, receive disproportionately small shares of research investment. So as federal funding ramps up, it's important that increases should target these under-resourced pillars. Again, this includes the end-use sectors. This also includes pillars that are not, that are cross-cutting, so clean fuels, carbon capture, and carbon dioxide removal. The second principle is that policymakers should support all stages of the innovation pipeline. So right now, DOE's portfolio is heavily weighted towards early stage research and development, but that second D, research, development, and demonstration, that second D, demonstration, is a glaring gap. The government devotes less than 5% to demonstration projects, mostly in advanced nuclear, but new technologies have to be demonstrated and validated at a commercial scale before they attract significant private investment. So this is one particular research, development, and demonstration roadmap that was developed by the National Academies of Sciences in its report on negative emissions technologies, or carbon dioxide removal. As you can see in the blue, the large-scale demonstration projects form an essential part of this roadmap. We advocate that for each of the other 10 pillars, we develop a similar roadmap that breaks it down by technology, but also by stage, and particular pays attention to demonstration. So we recommend across all pillars increasing demonstration to 5 billion per year by 2025. The third principle is that we need to take advantage of the full capacity of the federal government and other federal agencies to support innovation. So right now, DOE's Office of Science and Applied Energy offices account for about 3/4 of federal support for energy innovation. We recommend doubling that by 2025, but other agencies are going to play a significant role. So ARPA-E is a semi-autonomous agency within DOE. We recommend ramping investment to $1 billion per year by 2025. The Department of Defense already invests about $1.6 billion in energy technologies that also have a national security component to them. For example, lightweight solar power materials, high energy density batteries. We recommend that Congress appropriate $2.5 billion to DoD for clean energy innovation that promotes national security. We also recommend increases for the National Science Foundation, for NASA, for the US Department of Agriculture, and for NIST. Now, this graph ends in fiscal year 2026. I'll just note that fiscal year 2026 begins in October of 2025. So we still get to keep that expression, 25 billion by 2025. So the fourth principle is that we also need to harness the innovative capacity of our universities and the private sector. Right now, the primary way that the Department of Energy supports energy innovation is by funding the national laboratories. And these are rightly referred to as the crown jewels of US research infrastructure. But the government should also expand collaborations with external partners at universities and in private sectors. And we do this in other fields. In health research, for example, 3/4 of the funding that go through the National Institutes of Health fund extramural research at universities and medical schools and other research institutions. And we can do the same for energy. So policymakers have already created energy frontier research centers, energy innovation hubs to expand collaborations between federal researchers and universities and private sector. The national labs have also established pilot programs such as lab embedded entrepreneurship programs, or LEAP, also small business vouchers as a way to attract private sector pull into the national labs. And ARPA-E, SBIR give grants to small businesses. All of these programs should be expanded and built upon. And the fifth principle is that we should do more to partner with state and local governments to support regional energy innovation. And Representative Bonamici mentioned marine hydropower in Oregon. I think there are going to be many examples. States have different clean energy priorities, different energy resources, different industries, and we need to take advantage of this diversity. State and local governments are also locally connected. They're well positioned to build regional innovation clusters. So this figure shows a map of research universities, and those are the blue triangles, and DOE national laboratories, those are the green circles. And these tend to support innovation clusters. And you can see this by the number of clean tech firms, which are the yellow circles, and the number of clean energy patents in red. And it's clear that there are gaps in this map and that the federal government could do a lot more to partner with more states and more cities across the country. So these first 5 principles have all dealt with diversity of the RD&D portfolio along different dimensions. So diversity by technology pillar, diversity by innovation stage, diversity by research performer, federal worker, private sector, university, also diversity by region. This 6th principle is that we should set long-term stable funding targets. So investments in innovation can take a decade or more to pay off. And historically, funding for energy RD&D has been very volatile. And one thing we've learned is that this kind of volatility can actually depress or delay innovation. So the federal government should signal its long-term commitment to increasing annual energy RD&D funding over the next decade, even after reaching $25 billion in 2025. In addition to these 6 overarching principles, we've developed 3 immediate actions that Congress and the next president can take beginning in 2021. So first is that the president should launch a national energy innovation mission, and he can do this by issuing a presidential policy directive. And we have helpfully provided a draft in our volume. The presidential policy directive would establish a White House task force with the responsibility for creating and implementing a national strategy. And it should be chaired by the director of the Office of Management and Budget. We're told that for this task force to have any oomph behind it, it's got to be connected to the budget. This would also assign a lead role to the Secretary of Energy as the agency lead. Also, Congress should immediately provide funding up to $12 billion for energy innovation in the fiscal year 2022 appropriations. So in the regular budget cycle, the president releases his budget request to Congress in February, and then in March and April, the appropriations committees begin their hearings and begin drafting their bills to fund the government. But the president is inaugurated in January of next year. So there's a very short turnaround time. So we have provided this set of recommended funding levels in our effort to be helpful to Congress. Now, one thing that I would note is that on the right, you see current funding allocated by technology pillar in blue, and then in green, the amount of increase that we recommend going to each technology pillar. And we've taken our own advice. We've given the largest % increases to the least funded technology pillars. So at the bottom, we currently support foundational science and clean electricity generation on a very large level now. We do advocate growing those budgets, but at a slower rate. And at the top, carbon dioxide removal, I think investment was like $22 million at DOE last year. That is far below what we need. So we recommend ramping that up and giving it almost a 200% increase in FY22. And then the final immediate action that the US can take is that it should reassert leadership on international energy innovation. It did this in 2015 with the launch of Mission Innovation, which set a goal for the largest economies to increase their investment in clean energy RD&D over the next 5 years. And as this first iteration of Mission Innovation comes to a close, the US should re-engage and lead other nations in a new commitment and a race to the top. The US should also pursue new bilateral collaborations to address key innovation challenges, and should commit to ramp up funding for international collaborations to $1 billion per year. So this summarizes our report. I went through a lot of materials very briefly. Right now, I would just like to say thank you very much. Energizing America will be out on September 15th, and it will be available on Amazon. Also on ITIF's website, Columbia's website, and there will be a microsite as well.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Colin. That was a tremendous condensation of a lot of material into a short period. And thank you for doing that. I also want to make sure that we recognize the contributions of Julio Friedman, the 5th author on this report. I'm sure he'll be part of the many events that we'll have as the report rolls out, but his contributions were essential. And we look forward to his commentary at other events. So now I'm going to turn the podium over to Jeremy Harrell, and Colin is going to run his slides. Jeremy is the Managing Director for Policy at ClearPath. ClearPath is an organization that develops and promotes free market policies that accelerate clean energy innovation. Among other things, Jeremy chairs the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council, and he's on the executive committee of the Geothermal Resources Council. Before joining ClearPath, Jeremy spent many years working on these issues and others on Capitol Hill. And with that, I'm really pleased to welcome him to the microphone for a presentation of ClearPath's perspective on the energy budget.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join this event and talk about this really important issue moving forward. I think there is a huge opportunity, and so I really appreciate the hard work that all the authors on this report put together, and I think it lays out important key points that are going to be essential moving forward, regardless of what happens in November. And that's one thing that I want to kind of underscore right off the gate, and I hope the takeaway after for our talk, and we can focus more in on the panel discussion is no doubt a national clean tech innovation strategy is a climate imperative, and it is a national imperative, and we need to take our country's efforts in this space to the next level to take on the immense challenges before us. I think there are significant public and private shifts that are occurring that makes that possible. I think quietly, Congress is coming together on a lot of these things. It doesn't get the attention in the major publications, but over the last 3 years, we've seen significant progress, and members on both sides of the aisle, kind of across the political spectrum, finding that they have more in common than they have against each other. And ultimately, I think that we're well positioned come January, regardless of what happens in November, to capitalize on this immense moment. So next slide for me, Colin. And so I'm going to kind of give you all a little bit of an overview of our perspective of where ClearPath's coming from on federal research R&D, why we think a national commitment or a national call is an imperative for this nation, and give you a little more overview of what we're seeing on Capitol Hill and why we think that we're well positioned to seize this opportunity here in the coming year. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time here, but because David gave a kind introduction to ClearPath and myself, but I'm coming at this both from ClearPath, who is a conservative organization engaging with Republican policymakers on clean energy innovation policy. Our mission is to advance free market policies that accelerate clean energy innovation, and our overall view is kind of aligned with the view of the authors of this report, that the U.S. Has an imperative to help lead deep decarbonization efforts by 2025 through innovation and drive global uptake of clean technologies. I come at this having worked for Republican policymakers for a decade on the Hill, so kind of across the spectrum. I work for both conservative and moderate members, and so can kind of shed a little bit of light of where Republican policymakers are thinking, and ultimately, some of the involvement in industry groups as well of how the narrative has been shifting recently. Next slide, please. Overall, ClearPath is focused on what I would argue is this middle ground here. What is legislatively realistic, politically sustainable, and solves the global emissions problem? And that's tough to navigate. That's a fine line. There's a lot of third rails across the spectrum, but it has shown to be possible over the last couple of years, at least at the smaller scale. And I think there's important lessons learned that we should gather off those successes, because if we are going to ramp up clean energy policy involvement and investment, we're going to have to build off those successes from the past. Next slide, please. I won't spend a whole lot of time because Colin went a little bit over this in his initial presentation, but we share the author's view that clean energy growth relative to the share of the world's energy mix is growing or largely remaining static. I think we've seen a little more positive news in the last couple of years after kind of up from here, but certainly not fast enough to meet the clear emission reduction goals that we need to do by mid-century to deal with the climate challenge. Next slide. And so as we look at U.S. federal policy, we need to kind of keep this end result in mind. A lot of attention is given to U.S. power sector policies, both on the Hill and kind of outside in the media. And as we look at the current scenario, absolutely that's going to be an important part of the path forward, not only to clean up the power sector mix, but if electrification is going to be a big part of our decarbonization strategy, meeting the increased demand of clean electricity generation is going to be critical. But the power sector is only one piece of the puzzle. And so the intention on the power sector right now is important, but no doubt we need the federal energy innovation engine to be more focused across the economy into these other sectors. And so I think it's really important of the work that Colin, Varun, David, and Julio have done and kind of breaking down those key pillar areas that we need to invest in, because it does get this full grasp of both the US and the global economic sector. And then we need to look at the broader global picture. ClearPath sees the United States role in global decarbonization as a technology provider. We have world-class technological innovators here at the Department of Energy, our academic institutions and private sector entities that all partner to commercialize new clean energy technologies. And so we have to reduce US emissions and be a technology provider to the rest of the globe to drive global emissions down. Next slide, please. And there's a national security imperative on this. And that's a message that I think has really helped shape the debate, particularly with Republican policymakers. We see the competition globally in the energy space broadly from China and Russia. And I bring the China Belt Road Initiative kind of to the forefront here because of their investment in frankly uncarbon constrained coal assets and the ability to offer new technologies, because the developing world is still, in many cases, just choosing on the ability to meet electricity needs. They don't have the luxury of necessarily making decisions based off other attributes, clean being included. And for us truly to shift the global development trends, clean has to be both it has to be not only more environmentally friendly, but economically competitive with the emitting rules. And so that's why I also would point out, and I'll talk a little bit later, why I think there's been some significant things that have moved forward here recently on the global competitiveness front. A 7-year extension of the Export-Import Bank, for example, that was enacted in Congress last year, giving a little more certainty for that important tool to help US businesses export technologies abroad. The BUILD Act transitioning, formerly known as OPEC, to the International Development Finance Corporation, and that as a tool, and the ability for the US to hold equity in projects as we compete with China and Russia, because they offer these more substantial financing offerings. Next slide, please. And another thing that's kind of helping shift the debate is private sector momentum in this country. I only touch on the utility sector here because I think it's particularly telling, as we've seen a combination of net zero or low emission commitments made by the major US electric utilities. There's a whole other layer of this of corporate commitments, folks like Microsoft, Amazon, not only making internal company commitments, but also investment and commitments. Microsoft and Amazon committing to billions of dollars of investment to help catalyze new clean tech. And I think it's important that federal policy leverages that type and tries to incentivize more of that type of work, because ultimately, the type of billions of dollars of increase in federal funding that are talked about in the report are going to be a heavy lift. It is tough to reach those levels. And so we need to be able to leverage public sector investment to attract additional private sector investment. Next slide, please. We view kind of the policy realm and the future of federal RD&D policy kind of in a full soup to nuts range. It's not just federal investments in research and development. Important components of that is going to be in tax incentive policy, which leverage still taxpayer dollars to deploy new technologies and scale them up. And then ultimately things like the IDFC, XM, and other things that will help us export and finance projects abroad. So as ClearPath looks at the R&D policy future, it's turbocharging our mechanisms that we can both invest in do public-private partnerships to invest in research and development. How do we grease the skids for private sector financing that will help bridge the gap to commercialization and help scale up? And then ultimately, how do we export these technologies abroad? Next slide, please. We know this is a successful model. We've seen it with solar, and we've seen it, for example, with hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas sources. So a lot of this has been documented, but the combination of private sector research and development into the technologies and the mechanisms to get it done, an immense tax incentive to help ramp the technology into the market, and that is what has yielded frankly the natural gas boom in this country that we see today. And so we know across the technology spectrum that this recipe can help catalyze an array of new clean energy technologies. Next slide, please. And so, as I kind of mentioned at the early stage here, very quietly, Congress has made huge progress over the last couple years in this space. And if you look at the combination of investment, when you factor in both the tax side, the direct appropriations, direct spending in clean energy innovation, and regulatory and authorizing policy, we've seen an immense amount of of investment in an assortment of clean technologies across the power sector realm. I just use a couple examples here, like the 45Q carbon capture tax incentive, which a recent report from Rhodium came out, can leverage billions of dollars of investment into these technologies and immense megatons of carbon emissions reductions. Incentives for advanced nuclear technologies, regulatory reform that will help accelerate the deployment of those things, and the direct federal appropriations. So we've got to capitalize it. No doubt we can't rest on our laurels on that, but it's important to show that in this divided government that we've had, that largely you don't hear a whole lot about what's going on in Congress in the clean energy space. We've seen major successes. Next slide, please. Again, I don't want to harp too much on this, but we see the footprint across the key technology areas in the soup to nuts, federal R&D demonstration programs, deployment incentives, and regulatory reform. One thing I'd really underscore and completely agree that Colin was laying out is the need to ramp up demonstrations. And that's something that Congress has acknowledged as well. Next slide, please. Again, we've seen huge trends here in the FY20 bill last year is a huge progress. If you look at the percentage of the budget that's going to applied research, and if you do a second cut of that of key programs that were really in the applied innovation investment bucket, we've seen as much as 36%. So this is doable. The numbers and percentage increases that are laid out in the report are not out of the realm, and in fact, maybe it's not double tripling in 3 years, but we're on track at the moment to double over the next 10. And so, as we look at how we advocate for that and the outcomes that we're looking for, I think are what's going to be important that will drive the case to the federal policymakers that these investments need to be made. Next slide, please. One thing I do want to highlight, I talked a little bit about export policies and the tax side, but and something that I think it was important that was laid out in the report too is it's kind of clear that the research and development silos that currently exist at the department and within the Federal Energy Innovation are a little antiquated or not quite sufficient to meet the immense technology challenges we're looking for today. I wouldn't say that we necessarily need a complete reorganization of the bureaucracy. I think that's a beast of its own, but I think we're seeing an increase in use of crosscuts at the department because those Department of Energy, because those technology silos are not functioning the way necessary. And we see that in, for example, the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, a recent initiative to accelerate the research, development, and demonstration of long duration storage technologies, the Energy Water Nexus crosscut. The department recently launched a new industrial carbon capture initiative. So really the first time in nearly a decade where we're putting significant research and development cost share dollars into industrial carbon capture. So I think that's promising and something that we're going to need to build more on. Next slide, please. As we look at the advocacy space here in Washington, D.C., and why I'm really optimistic about the optimism around future action, both here in the next 3 months of getting a big legislative package across the finish line, but into the next couple of years. I see a whole new coalition of environmental NGOs, business groups, and conservation groups partnering together to advance common sense policy. And I think that's helping grease the skids for policymaker comfort in engaging in this realm. Next slide, please. Something that we're tracking here over the next couple of months is the Senate energy bill that Senator Murkowski and Senator Manchin brought to the floor at the beginning of this year before COVID kind of broke and upended things. Strong bipartisan support, lays out an ambitious 2025 demonstration vision across power sector technologies. Ultimately, that bill stalled in February, but is potentially getting revived here in September, and I'm optimistic about efforts here in December. And so it's something to track here over the next couple months that may not get the attention that the COVID package or something along those lines may be getting in the media, but it's something important to watch. And then it's important to know that the House is doing this as well. So they've already announced the 3rd week of September. They're going to be moving a combination of research and development bills moved out of the Science and Technology Committee. And I think that positions Congress to potentially make a deal on to enact a down payment on these innovation authorizations going into the next calendar year. Next slide. We can skip over this, but as I was kind of mentioning, because I want to make sure we get time to the panel, this bill lays out an ambitious demonstration agenda over the next 5 years, and something that I think is significant and should get more attention, because there's an absolute need for the innovation engine to put additional resources into technology demonstration. The time is now to bring these technologies forward and prove them commercial so that we can scale them up to meet mid-century emission reduction goals. Next slide. Again, here's some of those kind of key legislative initiatives that were included in both the House package and in the Senate package that we're hoping to see enacted. Next slide. It's just another frame of true momentum that we've had. And, you know, even though we're in a divided government, assortment of these technology bills clearing through the process and positioned well for the end of the year. Next slide, please. Another thing that I think is important to highlight, and as I mentioned previously, a lot of attention and progress has been made on the power sector side, but there's a lot more interest in the industrial space, and it's on both sides of the aisle. I use this bill as an example of the Clean Industrial Technology Act, one of those bills that's in the Senate Energy Package and likely going to be in this package that comes to the House floor in 2 weeks. And, you know, we've seen what I think is a really an interesting combination of policymakers that are engaged on ramping up additional industrial sector research at the Department of Energy. You know, Sean Casten, someone who has an intense private sector energy background, along with David McKinley, you know, a traditional advocate for coal in West Virginia, but sees the immense opportunity in the manufacturing realm. And then on the Senate side, we've got, you know, kind of a frequent climate warrior in the Senate on the Dem side, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And the next chair or ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, partnering on this. I think that sends an important signal that this is the direction Congress wants to move into policy. Next slide. We've seen House Republicans try to even lay out their wave of climate policy. I think that's a big shift, that there's proactive engagement in wanting to push forward technologies. And that is kind of soup to nuts here, right? The tax policy, research and development. When I was on the Hill and I worked for Senator Dean Heller, it was a Senate Finance Committee, it was very rare. There was a small community of Republican members willing to engage on energy tax provisions. That's radically changed. You know, Congressman Schweiker and Congressman Winstrup introducing a permanent 45Q tax credit. On the next slide, show a technology inclusive tax credit bill has been introduced in the House, with three Republicans and 3 Dems from the House Ways and Means Committee. Colin, would you mind going to the next slide, please? There we go. Led by Congressman Reed, Congressman Panetta. You know, when I was working on the solar ITC 5 years ago, Congressman Reed and Congressman Heller were basically the only Republicans willing to work on tax policy at that point. We've got a wide, broad swath engaging and Republican members introducing bills. I think that's a big shift and a huge opportunity. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, I think we're in an advantageous spot to capitalize on many of these recommendations that Colin, Varun, and David and Julio lay out in the report. And the key is going to be to find this happy medium of balancing what is important from a climate ambition standpoint and what is important and how the political makeup moves forward. And so I think it's a great time to be involved in the clean energy space. I think that the time is now. I think from a climate urgency standpoint, we've never seen more attention and the need to drive forward policy. And so I'm excited to see how things develop and look forward to working with all of you as we advance a clean tech policy moving forward here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And let me applaud ClearPath's contributions in raising the profile of clean energy innovation policy among Republicans and conservatives, and making the case, as you did so clearly there. So we have about 20 minutes for conversation. We're going to welcome a couple of other voices to the discussion. So let me introduce them briefly, and then all of the participants in today's webinar will have a chance to contribute. And we've got a lot of great questions. So thanks to the audience for raising those. I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but we will get to some of them for sure. So our two additional participants, Kim Dean. Kim is a senior advisor for BPC Action, where she's been for about 10 years. Her portfolio includes a wide range of energy and environmental policy issues there. Prior to that, she served on the staff of former Senator Jim Bunning, including as the chief of staff. And then the final participant, last only in the webinar, but first in terms of the authors on our small book or large report, depending on your point of view, is Varun Sivaram, really the driving force and connective tissue between the Columbia and ITIF groups, and who led both conceptually and worked all the details on the report. Varun returned earlier this year from a stint as the Chief Technology Officer for Renew Power, a major Indian energy company. And many watching this will surely recall his previous job as Director of Energy and Climate at the Council on Foreign Relations, and as the author of the great book on solar power and solar power innovation, Taming the Sun. So let me welcome them in, and I'm going to start them off with each with a question. We'll start with Kim, and I wonder, Kim, if you might comment a little bit on Jeremy's Venn diagram. How do you see that overlap of what's realistic, what's sustainable, and what's effective? And Varun, I'd like you to take on the #1 question in our poll, which is about international collaboration, and speak a little bit to the international dimensions of federal energy RD&D spending.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Yeah, I thought that was a great diagram, a great visualization of kind of what's going on and what we've been having to deal with in Congress, of just some of the politics that have been put at play with trying to work on climate issues. And so I think there's definitely a crossover in between everything that definitely needs to be taken a look at, but it shows that there is that space and that possibility of what is happening. I agree with Jeremy with what he said earlier, that there's definitely a lot of more momentum going on this Congress on both sides of the aisle, which is a positive. And I think we can only expect more to be going on next Congress. We're obviously hopeful that some will get done this year, but I think there's a lot of laying of the ground that's going on right now from all the different organizations here and that are working very hard to try to get some other movement going on.
Thanks, Kim. Varun?
Great. Thank you, David. This has been a wonderful event, and thanks for hosting it to ITIF. I also just want to point out, I'm very excited. We just got the test print of our new book. So here it is, and we hope next week you will check it out on Amazon on September 15th. Let me answer your question about international energy innovation. You know, I was struck this morning, the IEA launched their Energy Technology Perspectives report. They looked at 800 technology options and tried to chart a path to net zero. And the salient point for me was there's just no way to do this without some sort of road mapping effort and countries coordinating and collaborating with one another. I think, you know, in our proposal in Energizing America, we say that the United States itself should be the world leader in innovation and triple federal RD&D to $25 billion by 2025. But we alone will not be able to achieve the clean energy transitions that the world needs to. And so, you know, a critical element early on in the next administration, whoever that may be, has to be the United States reasserting leadership in mission innovation, where, you know, we have not been as constructive as we were when mission innovation was conceived. In addition to the multilateral forums where we create roadmaps and really collaborate on a series of technology missions, whether it's hydrogen or carbon capture, in addition, we should be, the United States should be finding bilateral collaboration opportunities, particularly with key trusted partners, Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom, where India, in fact, where we have a lot to gain by opening up markets. And we have a lot to gain by sharing institutional knowledge. For example, the United Kingdom wants to create a British ARPA-E that's modeled after the United States' ARPA-E. You know, my hope is that the United States views these as market opportunities. You have a great deal of opportunity both for decarbonization and for exports in India, for example, and inspiring a competitive race to the top. This is, of course, an area where the US is on a global playing field with other potential competitors. But if we invest in innovation and inspire others to do so as well, the race to the top changes the playing field of global clean energy industries in a way that the US is best positioned to compete well in, rather than a commodity-driven set of industries that currently China does very well at. So that's where I'd leave it in terms of international collaboration.
Thanks very much. I guess I would just invite others to comment. And if, I guess, on any of these questions you have a comment, just give me the finger and I will recognize you. I don't know if anybody else has a thought on international that they wanted to share. Yeah, go ahead, David.
David, you're on mute.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a thought on the Venn diagram. In addition to Kim's really thoughtful answer, I think a key point is that is not a static diagram, it's changing over time. And I think what we've seen over the course of the past couple of years is the area where all three circles come together has grown. And I think there's dynamics to increase that in the years ahead. I predicted it grows fairly substantially.
Could you just say a little bit more about those dynamics? How do you see the kind of forces there?
You know, kind of a headline, well, one headline example is, of course, in the 2016 presidential race, there was not a single question asked by any debate moderator about climate change. It's been a very different dynamic this year. We've just seen the profile of the issue raised dramatically. And I think that's a result of a number of different factors. There's youth mobilization, there's mobilization in the left in the political spectrum. There's broad support for clean energy, in all parts of the political spectrum, as we talked about. It's been talking with people in Iowa recently where, Republicans are deeply committed to, wind power and to the renewable energy agenda. And then, as highlighted by what we saw yesterday, nature is speaking up on this in some pretty undeniable ways. And, I'm guessing that everybody on this call saw the incredibly dystopian pictures that came out of the Bay Area yesterday. It looked like the Blade Runner out there. And this is what's happened with, basically 1 degree Fahrenheit of global warming over the course of the past, century. Imagine what it's going to look like when we have 3 or 4 degrees. So I think, it's not just that in the Bay Area, of course, it's also the record heat that we've had in Southern California, the record rains in Houston, and the list goes on. So I think the political space for this is increasing.
Thanks, David. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say we've seen a huge trend on the international side of more engagement. I mean, I think policymakers are taking a huge interest in this space and saying they see that the US's leadership in technological innovation as a national security imperative, and why you've seen things like bipartisan agreement to extend the XM Bank 7 years, when it was just 3 years ago that we were on the brink of we had no one on the bank's board. We were letting the authorization lapse. I mean, it's shifted drastically. The BUILD Act to give the International Development Finance Corporation additional new tools. We've seen the Trump administration on the nuclear space in particular go out and try to solidify more bilateral agreements on technological cooperation, and new programs launched to try to inject new American technologies into the global market space. We need way more of that, right, across the technology spectrum. And so I think it's a huge opportunity where there's strong bipartisan support.
And I'll just add in really quickly just to build off what Jeremy said, that we've been looking at, there's a huge global clean energy technology race going on. And the United States obviously needs to galvanize on that clean energy technology agenda. And China is 4th globally in what they're investing in clean energy, and actually is just continuing to increase their spending there. The United States fell to 14th. We put out a report last year on this. And so we've been encouraging, and think the United States is starting to look at just needing to invest more in clean energy.
Thanks. Well, let me turn to a different topic, which is how the policies get implemented. That actually, who does the R&D? And let me bring Colin back in. So Colin, one of your graphics showed distribution of performers. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the role of the national labs and how they fit into kind of the future of energy R&D.
Yeah, so most of the funding that goes through DOE goes to the national labs. We have 17 national energy laboratories, 3 in nuclear security, but the rest are in either basic science research or in energy. Right now what we're talking about is looking at ways to expand collaborations between the labs and the private sector, or between the labs and universities. So there are several models have been proposed. Energy Frontier Research Centers are university-based consortia. Energy innovation hubs combine universities and labs and private sector. And labs are also on their own proposing their own mechanisms. I mentioned small business vouchers, which give vouchers for small businesses to come in and use lab facilities to conduct research. And this is really important because labs have a lot of user facilities, X-ray sources, synchrotron sources, nanotechnology centers, a lot of user facilities that could be very important for identifying new materials, for identifying and testing energy relevant equipment. And bringing the private sector more into that lab setting to make use of these facilities is one of the things that we're talking about in our proposal.
Thanks. Others on the labs?
I think it's just worth emphasizing what extraordinary jewels those labs are. I mean, they're world-leading innovation centers across a whole range of the energy technologies we're talking about, as well as some of the foundational scientific research that underpins the energy technology. And these measures that Collins was talking about, finding ways to move from the lab to the market, are absolutely central to this agenda. So if you're interested in this, please take a look at our report. We talk about it. We cite to literature on this. It's a very important issue.
Thanks. Yeah, I think a key is getting more out of them. There's so much there. They can contribute so much more to real world progress. And that's one of the main objectives of our thinking there. Let's see. So let me turn to another question on advanced manufacturing. And Varun, I think I'll swing this one to you. So do you see manufacturing as part of the clean energy innovation system? It's pretty far downstream, but you mentioned China, and as did Kim. We know that China has become the manufacturing center for many products. So how do you see that fitting into the future of federal energy investment?
Thanks, David. I think you've made the point very well, David, that there's a risk of innovate here, produce there. And if we aren't careful to support all stages of the innovation pipeline, from conceiving technologies, developing them, piloting them, prototyping them, and manufacturing, scaling, and exporting them, we may very well supply the innovations for the rest of the world to manufacture. So even though in our report that you and I have worked on, David, we don't get into the topic of advanced manufacturing assistance. The point of our report is RD&D. I think it's a necessary complement to a robust innovation strategy. It's also worthwhile to note that, for example, Harvard Business School professors Pisano and Shi show us that manufacturing that's co-located with R&D can lead to more rapid innovation, where the process side kind of is interlinked with the earlier stage side, and you have much more rapid iterative cycles of improving a technology's cost and performance. But I think in the US, a coherent strategy to offer resources like we were just talking about, user facilities, manufacturing USA institutes for private firms to take advantage of, and providing incentives and subsidies for advanced manufacturing is critical to making sure that we innovate here and produce here as well.
Thanks. Jeremy, do you want to comment on this, and especially maybe link it to the national security debate? I've been fascinated to see some of Senator Rubio's work on this topic, and placing, he's dealing with a wide spectrum of technologies, but including some important energy technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Varun more. I think it's an essential component of the plan, and frankly, maybe the only politically feasibly way we get to the increases is in investments that are needed to tackle this challenge. It needs to drive economic growth in this country, particularly as we look in the near term. And I think we're going to be spending the next 3 or 4 years debating policy to re-inject resources into the economy to recover from COVID. And I think clean energy technology can be an important part of that economic recovery. And from a national security standpoint, like folks want to see, I think COVID has actually underscored the urgency behind that even more so, and being able to have your capacity to meet your own resource and technology needs. And so I think that's going to be an important layer to this. We've seen, you mentioned Senator Rubio, Republicans in the House has introduced a recycling and battery manufacturing bill, critical minerals and development bill, all kind of supply chain issues that I think are going to be essential to not only the development but the scale up of these technologies. And so I think it presents an immense opportunity to accelerate the cost decline in new clean tech.
Thanks. So we just have a few minutes. Let me just offer one final question, and actually going to build on Columbia's presentation yesterday, where Noah Kaufman talked about his report. And I want to make it clear that we don't view our R&D as a complete solution. It's not a complete solution. It's creating opportunities. So that discussion yesterday talked about both supply and demand side policies, and we don't in our report go very deeply into the demand side policies. But I think it's maybe just important to talk a little bit about other complementary policies that are needed to make R&D pay off. So we're talking about, by R&D standards, a big investment. By federal government standards, we're not talking about trillions. We're still talking about billions. And we seem to have moved into a world where trillions are the currency. But these billions can really leverage a lot if they're complemented by other kinds of policies. David, maybe you want to jump in on that?
It's a very important point. So thank you for raising it, David. I mean, all the RD&D in the world isn't going to get goods to market unless there's demand. And policy frameworks play an essential role in demand creation. And it's going to be interesting in the United States to see what type of policies are possible in the years ahead. One set of policies that, well, first I should say, of course, the House Select Committee has got a 600-page report on this, which I commend to anybody. And Representative Bonamici was talking about this, so it's a pretty comprehensive catalog. I think there's a very interesting dialogue right now around clean energy standards or clean electricity standards, and whether there might be some support, space for agreement on that. Certainly, measures building on Clean Air Act authorities in the power sector and elsewhere, I think are interesting. And there is some dialogue about a carbon tax. I think that's a pretty challenging political terrain, I would say, to say the least. But there is, there's some dialogue around that as well. But I think, the core point here is the one that I think you were pointing at, which is we need policies to help pull products to market as an essential part of this whole agenda.
Thanks. Kim, do you have a thought on the clean energy standards and so on?
So yeah, I think we've seen some movement on efforts on the clean energy standard and are seeing if it'll end up becoming a bipartisan issue. McKinley and Schrader had announced a proposal a while back and are working on a bill. There's a couple of Democrat bills out there. And as David said, there's a lot of swirl on looking at some more economy-wide approaches. I think there's a long way to go before we're able to get there with just some of the conversations, but I think those discussions are starting. And I will say the other topic that we've been looking at is infrastructure, because we think infrastructure needs to be done in order to get us where we need to be from a clean energy technology perspective and help with mitigation climate. And we see that as an opportunity for next Congress as well. It's definitely on the forefront of Trump and Biden. And we think that, while probably not going to happen this year, it'll probably start maybe looking at next year, and that might be an opportunity for some of this research and development and other climate technologies to get across.
Thanks. Varun, I saw your signal, so I'm going to give you the last word here, which you richly deserve given the massive contributions you made to our report, and I'll just offer a final closing thought at the end.
Thanks so much, David. I'll just mention 3 quick demand pull type policies, in addition to the great list David Sandalow mentioned. First, Jeremy mentioned several tax incentives that are very tailored. That's a great way of pulling technologies into the market. The second is a model demonstrated by NASA in which they used milestone payments to help SpaceX send a first manned mission back into space. And then the third one is exemplified by the Obama administration's super truck standards, where they very carefully matched the efficiency standards for trucks with the RD&D priorities for truck efficiency technologies. And that kind of sophisticated matching of demand pull and technology push is the sort of thinking we'll need across all technology pillars that we discuss. So I think your question is right on.
Thanks very much. And with that, we're going to conclude. I certainly hope that Venn diagram is going to grow in the coming years. And I know everybody who's participated today, including Representative Bonamici and all of our panelists, are going to help make that happen. So let me thank you all for your contributions. And with that, we'll close up.